Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social actions, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. This is a special one, our 20th episode and the first anniversary of Ferment Radio. Through the last 19 episodes, we've talked about microscopic organisms as a metaphor for planetary living: bacteria, algae, slime molds, yeasts, and more. While most people might be familiar with time-lapse videos of growing plants and flowers, there are also impressive short clips of mushrooms developing. We can see how the fruiting body gets taller, how the cap enlarges, and how the skirt-like ring dramatically pops. Since we humans cannot perceive things happening in mushroom time, we need specialized gear such as long-exposure cameras to capture these images. But what would happen if we had superpowers to listen to them? What kind of sounds would we hear? Do mushrooms make music? These are the questions I wanted to ask Tosca Terán, an interdisciplinary ecofeminist human holobiont whose work is located at the intersection of sound art, ecology, and craft. As part of the duo Nanotopia, Tosca takes biodata from non-human organisms and translates it into music. Among these organisms, she also works with mushrooms and their root system known as mycelium. But first, let's go back to the basics. I've learned pretty recently what is mycelium, I have to say. So maybe you could tell us what is actually mycelium and what caught your attention in it?
The way I generally describe it to people that I think makes it easier to really visualize is saying, it's the root-like structure of a mushroom. When you see the fruiting body, it's just not this strange little thing that's come out of decaying leaves and things like that, that there's more to it than that. Like there's this whole interconnected network under that came together to fruit perhaps in that one location. So it's the vegetative part of a fungus or bacterial colony. And it consists of branching thread-like hyphae, and they interconnect and they spread out. They can be very tiny and they can be incredibly, massively huge. As far as my interest goes, I guess in working with it, or I like to say collaborating with it, but of course there's arguments around that, was this interconnectedness, but also I was growing a lot of gourmet mushrooms or cultivating them to eat. I never really started thinking about working with them as an art material until around 2011. I started looking at different materials that I could work with. And it really happened after the Fukushima disaster, because I've been a metalsmith for so many years and working with metals, which the extraction from the earth is not great at all. And I've done a lot of recycling and upcycling, but still it's not great. But in line with the Fukushima disaster, I really studied Japanese alloys and working with particular metals or metal combinations from like really old Japanese techniques. And when this happened, I was watching the news. It was super early morning. So I was seeing Japan just getting covered by the tsunami, like going underwater. And I really thought that with everything else that was happening, I just felt even more tied to these techniques that I'd learned in Japanese alloys. But then I really started thinking about that impact and how I might be able to find another material that has less of an impact, but I could still really use with my hands. I probably saw an advertisement or there was something in the news about ecology design. And they were really starting to look at working with mycelium and different substrates like flax, kenaf, and hemp as a means to replace styrofoam. I started looking at my gourmet mushrooms differently at that point. Like maybe I won't eat them or let them fruit. Maybe I'll just break up this substrate and see what I can do with it. And it was really, I think before I started taking the substrate apart and trying to form it into different shapes is when I had some electrodes and a little device. And I thought I'd hook that up. Like, what if I place these electrodes onto the mycelium? I wonder if anything will happen. And my partner was totally skeptical, and saying like, there's no way, nothing's going to happen. Like, what do you think's going to happen? I'm like, well, why not? It's alive. So the module I work with, I could hook up to my iPad and have it run through like a different type of synthesizer, things like that. And I had this little handheld microscope that has little LEDs on it and UV LEDs. And I turned the UV LED on. We turned off the lights. I was in the kitchen and I hit it with these UV lights, and suddenly music started playing out of the synthesizer. We were both, huge exclamation points over our head, like, what in the world? It was actually really melodic. That's what was the most surprising to us, was that what we were hearing, the notes in succession, like it was musical, it was beautiful. I'm like, oh my God, I have to record this. This is amazing. So when I would touch the mycelium, lightly, and didn't have to be hard or anything like that, these changes would occur in the music. And so that was really profound moment, turning off the UV, because, I'm like, oh, it's not a good thing to be hitting it with these UV lights. I kind of say, as it maybe becomes more comfortable or settles down, then it starts really becoming active. There are different times of the day it seems to be more active and things like that, or more musically happening, or definitely depending on who might approach it. But at any rate, that's when I thought, this is it. Like, I've just got to really dive into this and see if I can find out what's going on here, or do different mushrooms sound differently, or different things. And
wow, I love it, this moment when you described this this discovery. I felt it had to be totally magical. Wow.
Yeah. And I just wanted to share this moment with people, and I started the Midnight Mushroom Music. So I just started sharing all these files on SoundCloud. Generally what it was all about was fungi. But at the same time, I was also learning about slime molds, and in particular, Physarum polycephalum, and for mapping it or thinking of it as like perhaps the alien collaborator or something, you could work with that's alive and put into these different scenarios and see what it does. Just let it do its own thing. Slime mold for sure is going to do its own thing no matter what you think you're trying to make it do, right? It's not going to do what you want it to do. Even if you put that oat flake right in front of it, it will go around the oat flake to another oat flake. So what I would do for the slime mold, like to be able to place an electrode into there. And something else I would do is I would just put like a Eurorack patch cable directly in. So an audio kind of device that it might climb over or grow on. I would have to allow the slime mold to cultivate into a particular, like, really thick mass. So I'm not potentially picking up some kind of micro fluctuations in the conductivity of the agar. And yeah, so slime mold wasn't what I expected. At least the Physarum polycephalum was more like a tonal cluster, which I guess makes sense in a way when you think about how they kind of move around, and this many-headed slime and how they come together and then branch out and then come back together. The sounds that were coming from them was very much like how they move, like their movement. So it was sending out kind of these tonal clusters. You could hear the sound almost ramping up, and then sending out, it was like a ping, and then slowing back down and then coming back up. So in a way, a very slowed down beat. I've worked with a lot of slime mold since, so that was around 2016 or so. And I've definitely cultivated and lots of slime mold, and also in the wild. And it's the same kind of response I've picked up.
So you would say that mushrooms, they are giving much more like various signals.
A lot more signaling or more variance. There are times when, like, I hooked up the slime mold and then I would hook up the mycelium together. And that happened, at least with the slime mold and the mycelium once, because at that time I was not aware Physarum wants to eat the fungi. And while I always clean the electrodes, just because I'm concerned with contaminants and things like that happening, because sometimes I'll be recording over a day or two, I had cleaned these electrodes, but quite obviously not well enough, considering that it had been sitting in a batch of slime mold, and that did get on the fungi. So the very next day, the mycelium mass had a ring of slime mold around it, and it still didn't really register with me what was going on, that this is not good. But the mycelium sounded entirely different at this point. It was kind of like bad jazz, or something. Just, it wasn't, the sounds were very, very strange, with the slime mold sending out these pings and the mycelium kind of in and out of these notes. But once it was attacked by the slime mold, the very melodic sounds were gone. It was really more frenetic. Of course, I change, maybe the synthesizer voice or things like that I'm using. But when I'm doing things like this, I definitely keep all the parameters the same, so I can really get more of a sense if there's some kind of change happening or patterns happening, because I felt terrible about that incident. But I've also hooked up moss and lichen at the same time with mushrooms, and generally that sounds really beautiful. And so it's almost like, if you want to say, the non-humans are working together definitely in that instance, and whatever symbiosis that they might normally have, just, it sounds beautiful.
Wow. And so I imagine that when you hook the electrodes, you need to hook them into something which is which is not liquid. It has to be something which is like more body-like.
Yeah, like it has more of a body, but there's all kinds of different electrodes that you can work with. I've worked with like TENS snap electrodes, or just like a snap electrode. And you might put a biomedical pad on that has a gel and things like that. And that works really well, I'd say, for sticking something to a tree. But I also work with wire. You can work with fine silver or gold. You can put those into something that's more liquid-like a slime mold. And you can then directly kind of immerse them into the mycelial substrate. I also work with some clips. They're a miniature duck bill or duck beak kind of clip. But even with like a yeast, if you can build up a thick enough mat or kind of get a clump happening, I've stuck things in soil, but there's so many things going on in the soil. I haven't done it in any wet soil. It's generally fairly dry, but the myceliums definitely, I have hooked them up, but generally I'm working with something that's fairly fresh and alive. So it's got a lot of moisture going on.
From like a fermented foods, which I would be curious about their sounds, is for example kombucha, because it's quite meaty, so it would be quite easy to put the electrodes in.
That would be really fascinating. I haven't even thought about it, actually. Surprising, because I have done a lot of kombucha kind of experiments and things like that.
So what do you think? And now I'm going on like a speculative side, right? Like let's go wild here. What do you think they are talking? If we could call the sounds talking, of course, because now I am like humanizing it, but there is definitely some activity. There are some sounds. You experienced that the sounds, for example, were very different when the battle between the mushroom and the slime molds was happening.
I think that's really interesting. I think about like interconnectivity. I know that like Paul Stamets, for instance, believes that mycelium are like these information sharing membranes. So I think if it's trying to tell us something, it's that we need to just be more in tune with our environment, which with the pandemic and everything over the past year and now, that's for sure. So I think about that. And I don't want to be a downer, but what's next? Like if we're not really going to see this entire world as a shared space that we're like these human holobionts. How do we work with all the other symbionts and non-humans?
It makes me also think of a sentence you said some minutes ago about this collaboration with mycelium, for example, in this case. Could you tell more about this? Can we actually collaborate with non-human?
I believe that we can. Well, I believe that we have to, and I've had some scientists say, but they don't have free will. It's like, well, I don't really know if they have free will in the sense of our free will. I think that we can start to view, and there certainly are people doing this, just how we work with nature, or can that be more of a collaboration, less focus on the human so much. So we get caught, I guess I'm saying that because I see that we all always, myself too, like we get caught up in this whole thing of how can we move away from just entirely thinking of ourselves and what we need and things like that, and looking at it more broadly with more empathy, I suppose. But that too is difficult. I can really get into a loop here about that because, my work in general is becoming, and I think too, for so many people over the pandemic, we're going more digital. And then that has its huge impact as well.
What you've been talking before, how did you discover that actually you can make a sonification of mycelium? I've heard many of your sets, but I couldn't imagine how you actually do it, which was quite interesting to hear, behind the scenes. So do you actually touch the biomaterial you work with when you create sounds with it?
It depends on definitely what the outcome might be. So when I'm out in the field, generally, of course, I'm touching them, but in that instance, I'm just recording the raw data, and then I'll later, listen to it or something if I'm not sitting there with headphones on listening to it play out. So when I say recording, there's different apps and things that you can use. So I'm having to use something like an app on either a phone or an iPad type of device. I might record MIDI in if I'm not doing, kind of like fluctuations, like looking at zeros and ones or something. But if I'm hooking things up to a synthesizer, then yes, I'm definitely during a performance, I might touch them, especially if I'm doing a performance. And as well with that performance, there may have been a little bit of a talk so people can see some changes. But sometimes I don't even need to do that. Like they're going to do it themselves. It might get very quiet, so I can point out on the synthesizer, like this voice right here, this is the mycelium. And then these other things would be me, or, usually I'm just adding maybe reverb or delay just to give it maybe a bigger kind of hall effect type of sound. Yeah, I touch them. For sure, I touch them. Maybe not the slime mold, though. But, and that's only because you can get it on all kinds of things, and then you have slime mold that might be transferred over. Where with the mycelium, it's okay to touch it. In an installation, I've had it covered. Usually I have to have them covered to make the gallery feel comfortable because, that's something interesting too. I think though, that's kind of changing and loosening up a bit as people gain more of an understanding. You say, well, I'm working with fungi, and people tend to really freak out a little bit. Like, am I going to get sick? Am I going to have an allergic reaction? Is it going to create mold everywhere? And always the main issue is people contaminating it, is the humans coming in and getting contaminants all over this mycelium. But something I've started doing when I have used certain types of electrodes, they have silicone. It's like a silicone kind of over stranded wire. And the mycelium, especially if it's oyster mushrooms, grows over that. Like they've completely grown over and kind of engulfed these electrodes, and then they start fruiting up out of the electrodes. So I don't pull the electrodes out anymore. I let them stay in that situation.
So you are collecting right now the data, let's say, out of this. Wow, so it's really long process.
Yeah, it can be. I'll do short pieces that I've been sharing a lot lately, but generally I've felt the longer I can keep the mycelium hooked up and people can listen to it, then they might get more of an idea, or they might be able to hear the patterns if there's patterns happening. So we've done like live streams too that have gone well over 48 hours. And that was something in Australia. I met up with some botanists and some other scientists and mycologists through the botanical gardens in Sydney. And one of them was asking me if I've thought about, if you do a time lapse of a plant and you see how they curl and coil as they grow, it used to be speculated that maybe that had to do with gravity and how the planet was turning, or electromagnetic waves or things like this. So he was curious if you might hear that. Fungi, as far as I know, is not growing like that. But I did find, especially with a lot of the gum trees in Australia, that, and I mean, I wasn't there for very long, but it felt like there was kind of like a dawn chorus happening that's similar to birds or fish. Like, when the sun starts to rise, there's a lot of activity happening, and that you could hear that the patterns would change from throughout the day and then into the night, and then in the morning activity started happening quite a bit.
So there is lesser activity during the night.
Yeah, there was some, well, at least with this particular species, there was less activity during the night and more activity started happening around the morning hours, kind of neutral throughout the day. There was activity happening, but it wasn't a lot. Like it wasn't a cluster of sound or just a lot of notes coming through. What I found is oyster mushrooms tend to be incredibly active, like almost hyperactive all the time. There's something happening. And the Ganoderma lucidum, which is also known as reishi, that feels more melodic and is very interesting too when I think of it being known as the mushroom of immortality. I have grown psilocybin mycelium, and I didn't let it fruit, and I'm not just saying that for legal reasons. It died, it got contaminated at a certain point, and so that didn't work. But I did hook that up, and it wasn't as magical, mystical, psychedelic.
So they have their own character in a way.
They definitely, yeah, they have their own character.
But is there a particular feeling you get while working with mushrooms? Is there some emotion or vibe you get from them while being even in one room with that mushroom there in the background?
Very few. There are people that often get very weirded out, kind of freaked out, and aren't at all remotely going to go in and check out there's a mushroom under that bag, is what they think, and there's sounds coming. They just look at me like I myself am from another planet and they leave. Versus people that come and have such an emotional response and literally, just start crying and feeling like, wow, I never considered that something like that would make music or even have, be alive or whatever people think. And that's really great and good, I feel, because they're now thinking differently a bit about their environment. During a residency I had at MoCA, Toronto, I would have living mycelium biosonifying and creating a soundscape like within this dome that people could go in and they could interact with it by touching electrodes that I had out for the human visitors that would send their biodata through the fungi, and then they could hear that. So people could come in and they'd hear these sounds and, not in the immediate know where these sounds were coming from. And I had the dome uncovered and whatnot. And when children would approach, as kids do, really young, super excited, like what's going on? And they'd run up to the dome because they just at first see this dome with a brain in it. The mycelium would get really like things would get very frenetic. And that was interesting to me because how is it seeing that? How is it sensing that? How is there a difference? Does it pick up on the vibration? For instance, I'm thinking maybe now it's vibration when the child would run up to it, because it wouldn't react that way if an adult walked up to it. So there's a whole bunch of us standing in the room, and I'm talking about the mycelium, and this music's playing, and suddenly the music came to a halt, like it just stopped. So we all, for whatever reason, looked over at the door, and because it was like this big double door into the studio, and this person had come in, and it was like the mycelium, we were kind of tying it to this person, like, wow, why did the music stop? It's been playing this whole time. So this person comes over and talking about vibes. It was pretty negative. I don't know who they were, what was going on. They went over to the mycelium greenhouse I had in this space, and I had just recently zipped it back up and closed it. So they went over and they started to like kind of mess with it. And I asked them, oh, if you'd like to see what's in there, I'd like to help you with that because I just closed it. And then they asked, well, why? Is there a monster inside there? Like, I kind of laughed nervously. I'm like, no. But the whole room, like everybody, there were at least a dozen people in there with me. We're all like silent, like, what is going on? And then I think this person finally picked up on, I think I'm freaking everybody out, and they left. The moment they left the door, the music started again, and people like myself too, I wasn't anywhere near the synthesizer. I wasn't near the mushroom. And so that was very bizarre. I don't know how did this mycelium pick up on everyone in the room?
Exactly. This is what I was also thinking, no? That it also maybe felt your attitude.
Yeah, our anxiety, because it was quite clear we all were going, what is going on with this person? Because they were really not feeling positive at all. And that was one of the more profound moments where I've been there and gone like, oh my gosh, there's something to this. I want to kind of dive into that more. And if I can at all, if there's a way of figuring out.
Wow, I love that story. Very powerful.
Something I'm doing now, and with the electrodes and allowing the mushroom to grow over them, I will take LEDs, so light emitting diodes, and cover them kind of with hot glue. Like people will do that if you're not familiar with electronics sometimes to make sure, if they don't have heat shrink tubing, they'll use hot glue or something like that to make sure the connections stay together where you've soldered them. So I cover the entire thing and allow the mycelium to grow over it. And I've done some different tests before doing that to see, so if somebody passes in front of a proximity sensor, and this is mainly something I've been doing because for COVID and people not being able to touch things and stuff like that. So could they pass in front of like a sensor that would then trigger that light that in a sense could be like them touching, and depending on the color of the light and things like this, what differences, or even a haptic motor, so a little vibrating motor or something there that would move. So that's something more recently that I've kind of been working with the mycelium, and particularly too, because I'm kind of taking this biodata now and bringing it into VR experiences, which I'm pretty excited about, actually. I mean, okay, and we talked about digital too, not being great. But I am working on a project, actually a couple right now. One is a fully immersive installation. It will be a physical and virtual experience that people can have with living mycelium that will be growing and creating the soundscape, but also reacting and responding pretty much in both environments, but really in the VR is where the biodata is going to be sent. So people will be able to see in different ways that we're working with visuals in the VR, their impact, like going into this environment and when they touch different things, and just even walking through, and how the great mycelium entity is interpreting their space in their place. So will it be a symbiotic relationship or like dysbiotic? And with that, we're working with like microorganisms and things. So it's depicting kind of the holobiont of the human. I've been really interested too in what we leave and what we take with us. Do you know, like in a microbial sense and microbiome, like when we touch something, we leave a little bit of ourself, but we're also taking some of that with us. And so trying to create visuals around that.
Wow, that sounds super interesting. Do you ever dream about mycelium?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. Yes, I have, or I think that's what I've dreamt of. I should say that's really part of the concept that I had for this VR experience, that's symbiosis, dysbiosis, is being able to, how can I show these things, or how can I really, I'd have to say a lot of my work has come from my dreams, and being a lucid dreamer, and then later being told or learning that I have a sleep paralysis, or that's allegedly, I guess, what it is, where I will have incredibly lucid dreams and be fully aware that I'm laying in bed. And that is very strange. But apparently that's a sleep paralysis thing. And so I didn't know that. Well, that's what I've been told. I don't know. But I enjoy it. And I feel that VR experiences, I think a lot of people think video games often, or, people going in there with those like first person shooter games and things like that. But virtual reality really has the potential of creating these incredible experiences, and not just for visually. Of course they're visual, but I think that you can do a lot more with them on audio and haptics and like just create this full sensory experience too. But so as far as dreams go, I'm excited about VR because I feel that it's enabling me to bring more of that dream time, if you will, into like kind of the world in a way. Because, okay, you make a work, and it's an interesting discussion definitely to have that about, when artists are creating something, like where does the concept come from and this and that, and do you think about what category it is or what you're going to label it? And I'd say it's more dreamlike, or been more dreamlike for me. It's just I have this idea and I then start trying to create that in the physical, like this reality, our reality. I don't know, maybe I feel with being able to create more of an immersive environment. And I really do like the idea of an installation where the people coming into the space can experience it on all kinds of different levels, and VR might be a component as well if they want to jump into it even maybe deeper on a certain level, because it's definitely not for everyone. But in that immersive space, I think it's allowing you to maybe control more of the perception of where people might be able to really get the whole world you're trying to create, or with the sounds and the visuals, and especially spatial audio, and bringing the mycelium into that. That's a lot of fun.
Following our conversation, Tosca was enticed to plug some wires into a SCOBY and get a biosonification of kombucha. If you are all wondering how it sounds, you can check it out on Ferment Radio's Instagram profile. It's a special treat for our first anniversary edition. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. This episode of Ferment Radio is brought to you by Culture of Cultures and is produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening, keep fermenting, and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.